Sudie, would you like to introduce your colleagues?
Sure. First of all, I'll introduce myself. I'm a deacon in the Diocese of Maine. I've been ordained for about 10 years, and I'm with two of my parishioners at St. George's. We have Nancy Davidson here and Catherine Yink here. And they are two of the three lay preachers that I've been working with. And I'm really excited to tell you all about it.
So why don't I suggest that we all turn off our cameras except Sudie so that we can get a big picture of them, and we'll get started. I am Julie Lytle, the Executive Director of Province 1, and it's my great pleasure to help host these conversations, which are called Deacons Talking on the Road to Emmaus. We have the image that when we're talking together, we can find out a lot that might give insight and appreciation to new ways of doing things in our own ministry, and to somewhat share best practices, as well as to give mutual support. So tonight, Sudie and her colleagues are going to be talking with us about preaching with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. So let me turn it over to you, and let's have a great conversation.
Great. I thought we might start with a prayer. And I have one here. So let us pray. O giver of the good news we are to proclaim, I pray for all preachers, for preachers who are full of inspiration and energy. Give them grace and humility. For those who enter the pulpit with pain in body and spirit that must be overcome, give them healing and courage. For preachers who face the challenge of a congregation that is splintered and fractured, give them peace. For preachers whose faithful presence is met with mistrust and judgment, give them trust and confidence in your power. For preachers in a community that is devastated by trauma, by flood, tornado, government closure, violence, give them hope and strength. For preachers who long to cast a vision of justice and mercy for the town, the city, the nation, and the world, give them imagination and passion. For preachers whose own well of spirit is dry and dusty, give them life-giving streams of love and energy, and the words that will work. Those who are weary, give them fresh grace for the road. For those who long to preach but have no place to do so formally, may they discover, along with their friends, that there are many ways to preach, often without words. And for all hearers of the word, provide them with eyes to see, ears to hear, and hearts to receive good news, hidden things that they have not known. In Jesus' name. So here we are. I wanted to tell you a little bit about my story and then give my colleagues here a chance to share their experience. There are two things that kept me from ordination. One was the fear of visiting people in the hospital, and the other was an absolute terror of preaching. Well, God works miracles, and I ended up being a hospital chaplain, and I love to preach. But it didn't come that way easily. I have been afraid to speak in front of people from the time I was in 5th grade. I was afraid. I did a bad job at a book report, and so I never wanted to get up in front of people and speak the words that I had written. I was fine with reading from the Bible in front of people. That wasn't a problem. It was reading my own book. And when it became clear that God was calling me to a ministry beyond a lay person, I was encouraged to deal with those things. And I dealt with the fear of preaching by going to a lay preachers conference here in Maine. it was an eye-opening experience. I discovered that I could get up in front of people and preach. It was actually Nancy's husband who encouraged me. They had a big car called the clown car. He and I and another person went from here up to Winthrop, and he encouraged me all the way because he was a lay preacher and did a good job. We have a tradition in this church of good lay preachers, and he was one. So he was my inspiration, and I realized that I could do this, and little by little, it's come to mean a whole lot to me. I think, yes, it's important for deacons to get up and read the Bible on Sunday, but if we don't preach, I think we're missing a real opportunity. So I have been blessed by rectors who encourage deacons to preach, and I've gotten so now I preach about once a month. Well, last summer, I had retired from my work at the hospital, and I was sitting with the rector, and he said, who is Calvin Sanborn? Maybe some of you know him. And he said, how about something new, Sudie? Would you be interested in teaching lay people to preach? And I said, well, I'll think about it, because I don't think of myself as a teacher. So I went and I prayed about it, and ideas started to flow. And he mentioned 3 women that he thought would be wonderful, and he said, do you think we could start a pilot project? And so I said, okay, let's go for it. I'm a little nervous, but you know, God gives you what you need for these things. And so last June we met. Jen Davidson, who hoped to be here, but unfortunately her father became ill and died, so she's on the West Coast. Nancy Davidson, here, I guess she's on my right, looks like on your right.
Sudie, I hate to interrupt you.
Yeah?
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
I hate to interrupt, but we're having a little bit of a hard time hearing you. And I'm wondering if your telephone's a little too far from you because you're fading in and out.
Okay.
Would you mind starting the introductions again and seeing if you can't move the phone a little closer?
Sure. Let's see if we can move a little.
Great.
Is that better?
Remove you a little closer to your computer.
I'm about.
That does sound better.
Is that better?
Yes,
better?
much better. Thank you.
Okay. So the 3 of us met, and we had the most wonderful evening. We shared a little bit about ourselves and our lives, and we had dinner. I showed them the video recording of me delivering my first sermon at that workshop, and I think we all had kind of a laugh.
You thought it was funny, so we went.
Okay.
Fine.
It worked out. And then we just went over. I had an outline. It's the one called Preaching Class, which you can in a minute you can show. But I think before you do that, well, okay, let's do that. No, not that one. It says Preaching Class, June 29 on the top of it. It was my script. I think I sent it to you. There it is. This is basically the outline I used and the script I used. I gave my story. We had supper together. And then I started talking about the process of preaching. Now, I used a book called From Pew to Pulpit, A Beginner's Guide to Preaching by Clifton Guthrie. And it's right here. And I think that information is on the list of resources. But I used that. I asked everybody to purchase that. And so we just worked, we met for about 3 hours that night, I think. We talked about the process of preaching, how you immerse yourself in the scripture. and read the lessons and find out a bit more about the passage. And once they've spent some time on these, you put it aside and you let it steep. So we talked about the whole process. I don't know if you want to go through this whole thing. Let's see. And then we talked about finding your focus. To find one point that you want to focus on. And then you write a focus statement, and then you talk about the purpose, the function of your sermon. And then we talked about, I talked about crafting the sermon and about the difference between writing a paper and writing a sermon. You're writing your sermon to be heard. People won't be able to stop and reread what you've written, so it needs to be simple and direct and active rather than passive voice. And don't be afraid to break the rules of grammar. Unfinished sentences sometimes are pretty powerful. And then we talked about the voice, when to use I, when to use we, and the few times you might want to use you. And then we talked about length. Now, I came from the Presbyterian tradition, and a good sermon there is about a half hour. But here in this church, we sort of aim for something that's about 1,200 words or 9 minutes, which works fine for me. And then we talked about getting ready to preach, how you may want to preach. I find myself most comfortable preaching from a manuscript, but I know many preachers who don't have a written sermon. I'm trying to remember. Did you have a written sermon?
I always write it because otherwise it's way too long. The way I can be brief to write it down and run down the script as I go, but that doesn't mean that you stop and make jokes and funny noises and things like that. But I didn't
notice funny noises.
Well, I've gotten better about that, but I find it's the only way to make sure that you make the point, 2 points you're after, brief enough. Also, not to just trail off.
Yeah.
Aim of what.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I think we want our listeners to leave the church with something to hang their hat on for the week. And I think all 3 sermons these wonderful folks have done that. It's been really pretty great. Then we ended up that evening talking about the physical stuff, how it is when you preach. I know when Catherine preached. Catherine over here, you can't see her unless you have to lean. Catherine has a wonderful voice, but it's quite light. And that was something you had to work on. It was great. So anyhow, after this evening, I said, I'm available when you're working. If you need help figuring out your focus or your function, give me a call. This was the end of June, and I think Jen was the first one to preach. And she preached the end of September. We have our lay preachers preaching, for the most part, the 4th Sunday of every month. Not Christmas, because the 4th Sunday is Christmas Day, and we figured that would be kind of mean. So they were spared Christmas Eve, Christmas. But so the summer went by. We met 2 weeks before Jen's sermon, and we had a preview night, and she preached, and we gave her some feedback. And I actually have a copy of the feedback form that I used to, let's see, where did I put it? Yes, here it is. This is the preview sermon evaluation outline. These are the things that I did I came early and made sure the mic was on, and I handed out the lections that the preacher was using to everybody. And then we listened to the sermon with the instruction to pay attention to ideas, main points, illustrations, and how the sermon is delivered. And I wrote down how long the sermon was. And one of us was assigned to be the note taker, which was very helpful. The ground rules we used for our feedback was that the preacher stays quiet and listens, which I think all
That was
preachers
really hard.
found
Very
really
hard.
hard. And the comments that we made to the preacher were, the comments were about the sermon, not the preacher. Be honest but kind. And I think we really did a good job of it. It felt good to me. I think based on what the preacher said, felt okay to them. We talked about what made the sermon effective. We tried to figure out the focus, which usually wasn't much of a difficult piece. Was there an illustration or a story that the listeners remembered, and why? Did the sermon use the scripture passage effectively, or passages? What did the sermon encourage you to do, and how was the preacher's delivery? Use of voice, gestures, too fast, too slow, eye contact. What might make the sermon more effective? And after the listeners have commented, we gave time for the preacher to respond to the feedback. And we mostly ended up laughing. One of the great benefits, I think, of this time I've had with these three is that we have really become involved in each other's spiritual journey. It was really a wonderful way of how a small group works. So that's basically about it. I would love to give each of these folks a chance to talk about their experience. So I'm going to work on the being quiet.
Yeah, you're going to have to help.
I'm going to have to remind you to please try to talk into the mic of the computer, because we're having a hard time still hearing some of what you're saying, and it's so good. We don't want to miss a moment of it.
And Catherine can. Yes, you had that.
Yeah,
yes.
okay. I was up there with two things in mind. One, I was preaching on the rich man and Lazarus. And two, I'm on the stewardship committee. And wanted to put a little of that in there too. And I don't really remember that one as well as I remember the woman as well, because that one I was telling a story, a very descriptive story about how people were ready to hear the word brought to them. You're talking about preaching with the Bible in one hand and paper in the other, and a historian in another one. And so I always want to know, well, what happened before that? What happened after? And just how does this fit in context? Are we drawing on some sources more ancient than the Bible? And just also, how does it apply to our lives? Sudie mentioned my husband, Ralph, who the preacher could send you out of here with your hair on fire, going out to do good on it. I didn't preach while he was preaching. He died, and I preached. And, they're not really related, but anyway, I really do enjoy it, and the preaching group is a notable ministry, Sudie mentioned. And it just, it's a pleasure to get up, be able to talk about spiritual faith, try and bring some viewpoint of view. It can't be anything, everything and thought over and over and over. But I hope your audience, and it just, it's a privilege. It's a real privilege. gift. We are lucky in this church that we are encouraged to do this. I know a lot of churches are rather more jealous of their time. That's about what I've got. Catherine,
Well, first I wanted to say that I'm very surprised to hear Sudie say that she doesn't think that she's a teacher, because I find her to be an exceptional teacher. And I feel that we've all grown in the short time that we've been together. She has a lot of wisdom to share. The book itself that she recommended is quite helpful. I thought that it was very easy, especially if we're living a busy life like we all are. You could take it in context, quite informative. I will say that I'm a classic introvert, so this whole idea of preaching was extremely overwhelming at the beginning. And my first thing, the first response in my own mind was, no, I don't think I'm going to pass on this whole thing, because it's very difficult for me to get up and speak in front of others. That said,
I'm really sorry to be doing this, but I think we need to somehow get you as close to the camera as you can and start again, because I've missed almost all of what you're saying, and I'm seeing typing from the folks online with me. And again, we really want to hear what you have to say.
Okay.
So would you mind starting again?
First, I wanted to say what a great teacher that Sudie has been. Is this easier to hear now that I'm a little closer? Okay.
Much better. Thank you.
She's been an exceptional teacher. She's been very informative and thoughtful and such a mentor to all of us. She's also recommended a fantastic book that is easy to read. It's pretty much for people that have busy lives, I think, because it was easy to pick it up and put it down when you need to go do dinner or put in laundry and pick it up again. And it was succinct and to the point. So I highly recommend the book as well. I was saying that I'm a classic introvert, so this whole idea of getting up in front of others to preach was pretty daunting. So for any other introverts that are a little leery about getting up there, if I can do it, anyone can do it, because the last place I would want to be is in front of a group. And then I did jot down a few notes just to share with you of my experiences. I did, when you're going through the process, first you're wondering, what is my text going to be? The text, for us they're chosen. You don't get to choose them yourself. And so you wonder, am I going to get fire and brimstone on my first try up in the pulpit? How is this going to go down? Luckily, I ended up with a beautiful verse from Isaiah, which was on peace and brotherhood. And so I was very much relieved that that was my first go-round of preaching. I do have a deeper appreciation for what it takes to deliver a sermon now. They make it look so effortless when our priests and deacons do it, and it really, there's a lot involved, but it's definitely doable. Having a small group, is so helpful, where you can share your feedback. As Sudie was saying, it's really invaluable. You can support one another and say what works and what doesn't in a very gentle way. And it's good to have that practice run as well before you actually go up into the pulpit, just so you know, how is this going to hit people? It's one thing to say it in your own mind and to yourself. It's another thing to have an audience and really have it strike people. I did find that it did vary in the congregations, whether it was 8 o'clock crowd versus 10:30. There were completely different animals, where the 8 o'clock crowd was very reserved, and I felt myself being more reserved in the pulpit with my delivery. And 10:30, we had a lot more laughs, and it was a little bit more at ease. But I think it does help to keep in mind who the audience is when you're speaking, and how to best address them. And I found this whole thing just very rewarding, and I feel privileged to be part of this group, and would encourage all of you to really hold on to, if you have a small group that you're working with, they can really be your lifeline in supporting you during that. Thank you, Catherine. I also want to say that after the actual sermon was preached, in all three cases, we gathered for a few minutes just to sort of take the temperature of the preacher, how that person felt. Did she feel heard? And I think to a person, they agreed that the 8 o'clock service was the hardest, and the 10:30, which is 8 o'clock is a spoken service. Then we have a service at 9 o'clock, which is a typical Episcopal service with Episcopal right to with music. And then at 10:30 we have a service that my husband refers to as right 3 1/2. And that's the one where families come. It's probably the biggest of the three services. We average about 70. And the others, I think the first service averages about 40. The second service averages between 20 and 30. And then so the third service, which includes Sunday school, is the lively group. And we have music that is sometimes traditional but often not traditional. So that's the one. It's a great way to end the day, I think. We do record all of our services, our sermons, and I sent Julie some links to those sermons. I'll make sure my computer's going to go to sleep on. So you can go on and hear. I couldn't find your text, but I've got.
Send it to you.
I have to look for it. I will, if I find it, I will put a link to Nancy's as well. I have links to both the audio versions of our preachers' sermons, and when I could find them, links to the text. So I hope you all have a chance to go on and look. I did want to show you a couple of the handouts, the preaching resources. I'm going to start with preaching resources, Julie, because I think those are helpful.
While we're waiting on this, I'd like to say just one thing about the preview of the sermon. That was very useful. We were all pretty good on the preaching, but we were very much better on sermon because we had this careful feedback. We found out that we had 4 sermons in there, at least 2. Or, too many illustrations, not enough, or that the term puke orange rug was not going to work. But it just, the friendly feedback and the critical analysis and reaction is very, very valuable.
Yes, I would agree. In Catherine's case, she has a very light voice, and we had to encourage her, even with the mic, to speak up. And I think Nancy had a couple of illustrations. One was good and one was not so good. And same with Jen. And the interesting thing is that all of the hearers came out with the same kinds of things. I remember when I was first starting preaching, Paige Blair, who was rector then, said, Sudie, that sermon is good, but I noticed that there is a second sermon trying to be born. Can you find it? And so she challenged me to look at my sermon and see what was getting in the way of the focus that I really needed. That was helpful. I want to point out these preaching resources. It's important to have a good print Bible. I have the New Oxford Annotated Version with the Apocrypha, New Revised Standard Version. I like that a lot. It's the translation that is used in the lectionary, so that's a good one to begin with. I also like to have more than one translation handy. I use the New International Version because I have a study Bible that has some good stuff in it. And I also like to use the Message. And many of these are available on Bible Gateway, so you can go out and take a look. I find that a really helpful resource, Bible Gateway. And then books on preaching. Those are some authors. Clifton Guthrie from Pew to Pulpit is for our little group, it was our required reading. I, 2 years ago, as sort of my own personal summer reading course, read William Hescock's How to Get Your Sermon Heard. Bill was a priest at one of the churches where I was a parishioner in Cincinnati, and so I knew him personally, and I read his book and was able to get in touch with him, and he actually commented on some of he agreed to look at my sermons and give me some feedback, so that was a real treat. I just listed a couple of things on the Bible. These are resources that I happen to have in my own library. Scrolling, Julie. It's important to have a Bible dictionary. I have an old Gospel Parallels from years and years ago that I got in a Bible class that I was in college. I was a religion minor. But there is an online version that does the same as the print version in an easier way, format. A concordance is a good thing to have. The classic is strong, big, thick book, and the words are keyed to the King James Bible, but except for that, it's pretty easy to work with. Commentaries, there are some handy ones. The one I have actually got in my own library because I knew I was going to be doing some preaching is called Feasting on the Word. There are 12 print volumes. I don't have enough shelf space for 12 volumes. So I got the Kindle version, which is cheaper and easier to carry around. So I found those very helpful. Finally, I list some internet resources. Whoa, whoa. Textweek.org has sample sermons out there. I find them good if I'm not getting ideas. They're good for getting ideas flowing. There are also some really good prayer possibilities out there. Bible Hub is an interlinear Bible that you can use for a literal translation of both the Hebrew and Greek. I took one Hebrew course at a local synagogue, a course on biblical Hebrew, so I know enough Hebrew to get me in trouble. I have no Greek at all. I wish I did. If I were younger, I would do it. GoTell.org is a wonderful place that it uses storytelling as part of as a way of sharing the good news. And it's just a good website to know about. Working Preacher is another place where you can go and get some ideas. And the same for day1.org. Some of these have sample sermons and they're quite helpful. But don't copy and paste. Use your own ideas. Just use those things for a springboard. We had a person who was here. He was a musician. He helped with our music for a year. He is now almost a priest. Isaac Everett. He did a preaching course that Nancy and I were in a couple of years ago, and these were some of his books about storytelling that were useful. So I think that's it for this handout. Take a look at focus, function, and use of language. Any other thoughts, ladies, while we're waiting for, here we go. is a useful handout to have to help people focus on one point. And there's some talk further on down about economy of language. I don't know about others, but I have a tendency to use more words than I need to. So it's important when I'm looking through my own sermons to look and try, and as I think Catherine said, it's really important to really get to the point. It's okay to use words, poetic words, but just don't use too many of them. Continue. It's great to be able to look at this. Language, rhythm, repetition. These are things that you can use. You don't want to overuse them, but sometimes they can be really effective. I've done sermons where you have one sentence that kind of runs throughout the sermon. That can be effective. But like many effective things, it can be overused. So I find it important to pay attention to. And then again, I think I talked earlier, use active voice rather than passive. Sometimes when you're talking about a Bible passage, it's good to use, put the characters into the present so you can get your hearers to begin to imagine, get your hearers to put themselves in the verse in the passage. So I think I got everything, Julie. What have I missed? I think I got everything.
I think we have. What I'd like to point out to everyone, I put it in the chat, but we do have the links to the sermons here on the page, and I will also bring in the links to the handouts that Sudie used. They are things that you can click on the title and either download the files if you'd like or browse to the web link so you can actually hear the sermons that we've heard described in terms of the process, and you can get a sense of the after that happened as a result. This is a time when we can bring in your questions, and I think earlier on it was Felix who was curious about the practice session. Who all's involved in that, and is it a cross-section of your congregation when you're getting a chance to get started, or is it something different?
It's just the preachers and the mentor, so it's a small group. In our case, a preacher and 3 people. It would be fun, and I would be interested if somebody would like to organize it here anyway, of having a group that meets and talks about sermons. One of the things I'd like as a preacher is a regular meeting with people who are my hearers to hear if I can improve or what they like, what they didn't like, something like what we do on a small level with these guys, but that hasn't happened yet. But I think it would be fun.
Sudie, when I was in seminary, there was a group that we called Partners in Preaching. There's an actual formal process that was developed, and it's very much what you're doing with your colleagues, is having a group that's always listening to and preparing together what's happening. So everyone's in a rotation. You're always sharing the prayer life of the lectionary readings on a weekly basis, but it's different people taking turns to preach or be feedback givers. And it, as you described, really can bring great depth to the relationships that you share and your own spiritual journey, as well as the word that you break open for the community. So it is a great way of being able to enhance the preaching process.
That I would want to be involved in a really big group. This is very personal preaching. You tell stories, you use language and imagery to involve people, get their brains going, and their hearts if you're lucky. And if you start doing sermons by committee, I think something is going to be lost. I like very much working with 3 or 4 people who, Sudie I did this other class with, but Catherine and Jen I didn't know each other very well, and it's an intense experience, and I value that on a small, focused level.
I'm sorry if I was misunderstood. I didn't mean to suggest that you would be creating a sermon by committee. It would be one person as a preacher and the others as prayer partners and feedback givers. But the fact that the group is committed to meeting on a regular basis as each person takes their turn being in one of those roles can be a very supportive process. So I certainly would not mean to suggest that it's a committee-developed sermon.
No, I think I was mostly emphasizing just, to me, that the value of having such a small and intense group is very great. And this other would be an interesting thing to meet more regularly, be more part of weekly life. That is valid too. I just like this.
Do you want to say something, Kathy?
We've got some practical questions coming up in terms of how often do you meet and how do you deliver in terms of reading the sermon or using outlines or being spontaneous. What are some of those other practical things? And then there's a question about could you say more about the newspaper part of preparing a sermon and what are kind of the third rails? So open it up, especially when you get into the controversial issues that the newspapers sometimes are carrying, especially today.
Delivered the sermon on the minimum wage is on the West Coast with her family. But you'll see, if you listen to Jen Davidson, you'll hear that we had an issue here in Maine. We voted to raise the minimum wage, and she had very, very firm ideas about it. So she talked about that. I preached the Sunday following the election, and it was probably the hardest sermon I have written, but it's probably the one that the rector said you really used your prophetic voice. It was difficult because while I knew that there were a lot of people in our congregation who were afraid or really upset about the election results, I also knew that there were a number of people in our congregation who were not upset at the results. And so I felt like I was walking a fine line.
But I will say, if I can jump in, that Sudie did just an exceptional job. That was beautifully done, just to include everyone in God's family matter. Everyone has a different reason for their beliefs, whether it be financial or ideological. Sudie was able to take such a difficult time and to bring everyone together to make them feel like all were welcome here, regardless.
So when I say preach with the newspaper in one hand and the Bible in the other, it's basically we don't preach from the newspaper, but the newspaper influences, I think, what I would call the function of the sermon, what we'd like our people to leave thinking about, how best to follow Jesus in a world that is fractured and difficult.
I think, too, to take an ancient text like the Bible and make it most relevant today. These are people that lived a long time ago, living very different lives during different times. But some things don't ever change. War, corruption, but the names may change. And maybe just to take a fresh take on something, but also to acknowledge what we're going through in this modern age. I think it's important to make people feel that the church is relevant. This is very important.
We also have one preacher. We're blessed with a whole bunch of preachers. So we've got several retired, and then there's lots of infants and people. But one of them who was retired from a long career is one a lawyer and two as a priest. He looks at the text and says, "Okay, fine. He preaches social justice. That's always it, and we always have 5 hymns. But still, he has the one theme with many, many facets.
This congregation is different, I think, than many. We are very active in the world. Our rector really understands that we need to be out in the world, and so we really do need to connect the Bible to the world. And I think as a deacon, this is my wheelhouse, and I really enjoy it. It's a challenge, yes, because there's some things we can't do in the pulpit. We can't say, don't vote for this guy, vote for this guy. And we have people who have different views, which is always a challenge. I remember one time I preached on universal health care, and the senior warden at that time took me to task, and I was newly ordained. It was terrifying. We're still friends. He's fine. But it was, for a novice preacher, it was just a little scary. I see that Felix, I think, asked a question about how we deliver. I have tried. I personally deliver from manuscripts. Did I bring a copy of mine? Yes, I did. This is what my sermons look like. Whoops. Thank you, ladies. If I were to help you, friends. This is I double space and a half, I guess. I indent to make it easier for me to read so I don't get lost. And I underline to help with emphasis. That seems to work well for me. I've tried to preach spontaneously, and for the most part, it doesn't work. I've tried using an outline, but what happens is that I have something that I've written down, because I do write them down. I care about the words. I work on the words, and if I'm preaching without my manuscript, that's an uncomfortable place for me to be. So, and I think we're all pretty much hooked onto our manuscript at this point.
Also, we know we're going to have to turn them in. It's going to be on the website. You've done your due and all of this, and know you have to go home and write it out. It's easier just to hand off the manuscript when you leave.
I would also say for me, if you're someone that's kind of nervous in the pulpit, once you get up there, you may have memorized or you think you know what you're saying, but then all these people are looking at you. For me, it's just reassuring to have it written down and to have my finger on it so that if I need to look down, I can. And that assurance just makes me relax as well.
I think that's a key phrase. If I need to look down, I can.
Yeah, we try and look up so that we're not, and one of the feedback items that we look at is eye contact and are people connecting with their listeners. That's really important. I practice a lot so that I probably, for the most part, if my manuscript disappeared, I could pull some of it out. That said, about I guess it was almost 2 years ago now, it was Martin Luther King's birthday, and at some point, I think it was between the first and the second, we only had 2 services then. Between the first and the second, a kind person had picked up my sermon and put it on the pulpit for me, and I'm preaching away, and suddenly I realized that the pages had been reversed. And so I had to just say, you're going to have to pardon me. I think things are out of order, and we'll be starting. So it was one of those embarrassing moments, but I survived, and we all had a good laugh.
You are the only one who remembers.
Well, I remember it because I had the tape recorder on, and I have a tape of it.
Oh, good. So you can listen to it often. That's always fun.
So, any other questions?
Jeff has added a suggestion in terms of Trogler's Imagining a Sermon, which is great. I'd be curious if there are other resources that people have picked up to add to what
yes.
Sudie's done. Feel free to type them in the chat box.
The book that I recommended that we all read, actually at that preaching workshop, the author used some of his manuscript as part of our training. He was the one that led that weekend, so it was kind of neat to see the book when it came out.
Did you recognize anything in it? Were you in it?
No. What did Jeff say? I might. Oh, imagining the sermon. Yeah. Thanks, Jeff. Hi, Jeff.
Are there any other comments or questions?
Felix is typing. I'm close enough so I can read.
Kind of like Facebook, isn't it?
I wanted to make one comment while we're waiting for the question, and that is, there is a definite process that's recommended in this book, and it's definitely helpful. My own opinion, and Sudie, you may disagree with this, but I would also not be afraid to put that aside if you feel like things are coming to a standstill. I'm someone that basically preaches, if once I've got, the main idea going, and I kind of know what's going to be the topic, things start coming to me. And I think with meditation and prayer, things that you may not have thought of before just start flowing, and it may be at the most inopportune times when you don't even have a pencil ready, but like you're in the shower. But don't be afraid. Sometimes I was finding during this sermon that I'd read, and I've only done one, I was trying so hard to stay with what I was supposed to do, and everything came to a halt. I just got stuck, and I wasn't able to write anymore. And I needed to step away. And I think there was a couple of days that I stepped away and then came back and just let it go and let it come. So I would recommend not being afraid to do that.
I would agree with that. I had mine absolutely all done Friday night. Saturday morning it fell apart. Absolutely. I didn't know what I was going to do, but with a little prayer and a little help and a lot of flapping around, it's a better sermon than what I had Friday night. So you can't be afraid, and you've got to trust which will come.
I can say yes to that. I've had moments, or I've had times when I have literally run out of ideas, or I haven't even come up with an idea. I remember one time there was one that I just couldn't get started. So I walked away. I went in and I sat in the room where I say my prayers, and I just said, Lord, help. And into my head came, help, thanks, wow. I had been reading Anne Lamott's book, and that gave me the springboard for the sermon. I can't remember what the lesson was, but or what the lessons were, but it just was the springboard that got me going. So I think prayer is a really important part of the whole process. It's not about us. One of the things I realized when I got over my fear, I realized that it really isn't about me. It's not a report to the board of the library. It's me being a vehicle for God's grace. And I've had sermons that I thought just completely sucked. And people have come up to me and said afterwards, I really needed to hear that. And Paige described it well. She said, there's a magic that happens between your lips and the hearer's ears. That's where the Holy Spirit comes in.
That's the spin spot. I remember what my sermon was. It wasn't Dives and Lazarus. It was the rich man's tax collector. Yeah. I do everything. me, and the other was, Lord have mercy on me, a miserable sinner. I'm glad I remembered that. That was worrying me.
I'm loving seeing all these book ideas that are coming through. I can see Amazon is going to get some more business. Yeah, will that come? Will the chat come?
That's always dangerous. That's always dangerous.
Amazon?
Having Amazon
Yeah,
and a
I
new
know.
list of resources.
Will the list of resources come through with the tape?
What I will do is it should be visible on the tape, and for those of you that are registered, we'll send out a summary of all of these resources once the call is ended, so you'll have everything to look back at.
Any other questions?
I'm aware that we're about 5-10 minutes from time. Are there other stories you want to share, or are there any preaching stories from the folks that are participating that you'd want to share that might exemplify things that you've gained as some best practices for preaching?
I'd offer an experience that I had
Can you speak louder?
a number of years ago when I was preaching about this time of year, and the gospel for the day was the Annunciation to Mary. So it was fourth Sunday of Advent. And in the newspaper, in the weeks just prior to that, was a story of a young couple in Delaware where they went to a hotel, a young couple from New Jersey who went to a hotel in Delaware, had a baby, and put the baby in a dumpster where it froze to death that night. And that kept coming to my mind as I was trying to write the sermon, and I tried to write another sermon instead of talking about that story, and ended up spending days writing something that I just looked at and said, that's pure pablum. So I ripped it up and prayed on it, like you said, Sudie, and probably 4 hours later had 7 pages of poetry, just taking the story of Mary and this young couple and weaving them between one and the other, about just being a scared teenager having a baby, and the difference being God in the presence. And I had people come up to me years later and say, the reason we joined this church was because we heard you preach that day. So it's really amazing. You never appreciate, and hopefully you never appreciate, because otherwise you get a swelled head, but you never appreciate how the Spirit will move through you if you just let it and just preach the gospel and take the story and don't be afraid of it.
Great, what a great story. I'd love to read that sermon. Linda says, do you normally try to incorporate all lessons or choose one that speaks to you? I like to be able to use two. One time I think I used all 3, at least 2 in passing. You can't, I don't know how I could do all 3 all the time. I remember there was one time when the Psalm didn't reach me, the Old Testament, New Testament gospel just left me cold, but I preached on the collect. So
we have a Thursday service, a healing service that is 2 to 15 people. And we talk about, we work out of, we used to be Lesser Feast and Fast.
Holy Men,
Holy
Holy
Men,
Women.
Holy Women. And so there isn't a formal sermon, but we all talk. And there was one set of readings just recently that the Old Testament and the New Testament and the Gospels added up to 3 rules of life.
Yeah.
And that would have been an easy way to put together a sermon. Some days come out of the same book.
Yeah. The lectionary people are mysterious.
Which is why I like to go backwards and forwards and see what happened before that and what happened after.
One comment that I wanted to make that I was just thinking of is I'm someone that dabbles in poetry now and then, in writing poetry, and it's very important to keep in mind a good poem, and I think a good sermon, this would hold true for, contains an element of risk. You have to put yourself out there in some way, and perhaps that just means acknowledging something that scares you, or that you are concerned about, or that has happened, or that you've heard of. Something I always try to keep in mind, you know, we all have this common thread. We are all, you know, filled with these same emotions. And the last thing I want to do is deliver a very heady message that people forget before they even left. And I think something that people can relate to are, you know, the events of the time, the emotions, human emotions, and also, you know, kind of piquing their interest with putting your own self on the line a little bit. Don't be afraid to take a risk.
Well, it seems like we have a lot of wisdom that you all have shared with us this evening. I think it's going to be fodder for a number of sermons for the folks that are participating as well as those that will listen to this online. So thank you very much for walking with us for a while and sharing your experience and giving us such highlights to be able to hold on to. I want to note that next month, January 19th, will be the next Deacons Walking on the Road to Emmaus program. We've got Bonnie Matthews, who's the deacon at Trinity Episcopal Church in Hartford, Connecticut, talking about the foot care ministry that she's initiated. And it's a real ministry of colleagueship coming together, bringing what she thought might have been disparate groups to really become a much more strengthened ministry, blending medical folks with the church folks that usually had been separated ministries in her life. So please join us again next week. We'll be sending out the announcement. And again, thank you, Sudie, thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Nancy, for sharing your stories and your experience and helping us to be better preachers. Blessings to all, and Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and we'll see you in the new year.
Thanks, everybody.